Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today, the title of which is Will DE&I Survive the Storm? Fighting for Diversity as a Business Priority. My name is Craig Unsworth. I'm Chief Product Officer here at Papirfly, and I'm also executive sponsor of our internal DE&I group.
And I'm Danielle Gianotti. I work on the UK sales team. I've had the pleasure of helping global companies activate their corporate employer and DEI strategies over the last few years. So really pleased to be here today.
We're really committed to DE&I at Papirfly, and the B we count as belonging. It's very, very important to us that everyone in the company feels like they belong when they work here. And so it's been a key priority for us, involving lots of different activity internally and externally. Today, we're really lucky to have two global experts, one on culture, one on employer branding. We'll meet Emily and Yona shortly, but I wanted to just start with a really interesting prompt from McKinsey. So we have a slide to share, which is in 2020, the global market for DEI was estimated at $7.5 billion. They projected that that would grow, more than doubling to 15.4 billion by 2026, which obviously is just a few years away. Yet in the same study, they concluded that it would take another 151 years to close the gap just on economic gender. That's it. And it prompts us to ask, are we doing enough in DE&I? So before we zone in on that and go to our experts and look at that question, we have a short 90-second video to play for you. So that's just a little something so you can see how we are approaching DE&I internally at Papirfly. Every company is different, but for us, we've focused on 5 areas of underrepresentation. It's important for us that this is about everyone, and it's absolutely about culture and how our employer brand and employer value proposition sits with our people. So that's a really good moment to move on and meet our panel. I'll pass over to Danielle to do some introductions.
Thank you, Craig. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be joined here today by, firstly, Emily Firth, who's the founder of The TruthWorks, also former head of employer brand at Booking.com. And we've also got the lovely Yona Gini, global employer brand lead at the Web3 security tech platform Ledger. So firstly, Emily, would you mind telling us about The TruthWorks and also your role?
Sure, I'd love to. So you mentioned my past life there. I was formerly heading up employer branding at Booking.com, where DEI was a core part of what we did. It was absolutely symbiotic with the DEI team, and we wove it through everything we did. It's always been important to me in my career. Now I'm the co-founder of an agency called The TruthWorks. We really focus on company culture and how you communicate that internally and externally, and how you actually create cultures that we would want to be a part of. So we always see ourselves doing a good job if we walk away from working with a client thinking we would love to be there ourselves, and that's a company we would join. That's our sort of benchmark for success. And the TruthWorks really is all about having hard conversations and the impact that comes with that. So we really believe that when it comes to talent, being honest and open about who you are as a business, what you stand for, and actually making that true for talent every day will stand you in good stead, and is the only way really to attract and retain talent in this market.
Absolutely, thank you. And Jona, can you give us an overview of Ledger, please, and your role there?
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Jona. I'm head of employer brand at Ledger. Whenever I ask the question, who knows Ledger, there's very few hands up in most rooms or virtual rooms. But if anyone is in crypto, they definitely have heard of Ledger. We are a French scale-up. We produce this device that it's called a hardware wallet. Our head office is in Paris, but I am based in London, and Emily and I know each other from a couple of years ago. I think one of the employer brand events that were happening in London a couple of years ago. And yeah, I'm very passionate about the topic. I'm really looking forward to see where it goes in general, and definitely great to be part of the discussion.
Thank you, fabulous. And so today I wanted to start by sharing a couple of key stats, one from Glassdoor and the second being from Monster. So it said that 86% of job seekers do factor an employer's reputation on their DEI and B strategies within their job search, and that 76% report a diverse workforce is an important factor when considering a place to work. However, despite this, it only seems that 5% of recruiters are deeming this as important, and 10% of business leaders have felt compelled to cut diversity programs during economic downturns. So Emily and Jona, the first question for you would be, have you seen a change in momentum in the past couple of years around DI and B and people strategies? Maybe if we start with Emily first.
I was being polite. Sure, I'll start. I'll kick us off. So look, I think there's a few different things at play here. I don't think it's a black and white answer to your question. I think if you look at those stats around recruiters thinking it's less important, you're looking at recruiters whose teams have been completely scaled back, who are operating under super high pressure, you know, told they have to deliver with much less resources than they had previously. They're now looking at getting bums on seats and getting through the work that they have to get through. So whereas before they might have had more bandwidth to think about creating, for example, a diverse slate, they're now just trying to get their jobs done and their recs filled. And I empathize with that position. So I understand why that's coming through. That said, as you noted, there is a huge conflict with the fact that talent are increasingly looking for diverse, inclusive, and equitable places to work. Absolutely, because they understand that that will help them to get ahead, and they understand that that's a place where they potentially will thrive. But what they're not looking for is a box tick. So I think the way we talked about DEIB before was much more a self-contained project or something which was an exercise or a group of different looking faces on a career site. Now what Gen Z, and increasingly not just Gen Z, but actually talent leaders and people more senior in the businesses are looking for is actual evidence of programs that support an inclusive workforce. So we see it coming through in different ways. And I think the reason these stats are complex is DEIB in its old state of kind of existing as an individual and something that you did as a one-off is no longer necessarily the case for good and bad, which we can cover more on. But I think what we're actually seeing is people looking for evidence of an inclusive environment. So for example, even when we're talking about things like hybrid working or the ability to work flexibly, that is an inclusive policy that enables someone who has care responsibilities or has a disability to be able to have access to that workplace. It shows up in the holidays that you celebrate. You know, are they only for one type of religion, or are they only for a certain demographic of your audience? So I think we're looking for evidence more than that we're looking for, you know, words around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I think that's the difference, and that's why these stats are problematic.
Absolutely. And Jona, maybe on this, the second question around Emily's point about support, do you feel there could be more education in general around DI and B in the workplace?
Yeah, definitely, and I completely agree with Emily. I'd like to see a lot more action rather than just, spreading awareness, which is also great, but you need to kind of tie it in with actions. We see so many, it's June right now, and so many companies have changed their logos into, preparing for Pride, and they have put their logos in rainbows and things like that. And when it's March and everyone is, all over International Women's Week, I'd like to see actual actions rather than just, because a logo means something, but then, as you say, policy actually showing how things work, they do actually make a difference. And in terms of if there is more education needed, God, yes, always. I think just for about everything, education is always needed. And I think this is actually part of an action that maybe companies can take, is to not just raise awareness, but also provide a lot of education, like different training. I know unconscious bias is one of the basic ones, and a couple of years ago when I was at Vodafone, we launched it, and it was a huge deal, and I think it should be like the basic for most companies, but definitely never enough education, because I think also companies and countries are in different places. I'm based in London, but the majority of my colleagues are actually based in France, majority in Paris. And there's many different, even in terms of rules and laws, everything is a little bit different. And also in terms of awareness, so, and the information that people have. So I would be a strong advocate for education, and companies leading the way by providing at least training on how to have a diverse culture at work.
I think that is really important, and you make a really good point. We decided as a company that it wasn't right for us to change our logo to a rainbow, a fine logo. It's not a priority for us. The priority instead is looking at how we support our colleagues internally. So we've diverted our attentions during Pride Month to thinking about how we support people internally, and how we make sure that we put in place actions that last throughout the whole year rather than just a month of marking it. It is culturally different. Every single country, company, culture needs something different. And one of the things that we do, of course, as the creators of brand management software, is to build in options for people to do what is right for their people. And I think that is really important, because it's education with the flexibility to make sure it's contextually relevant, isn't it?
I want to pick up on a couple of things, if I might,
off
the back of what you said. So I think what Yona was saying about action is very important, and I think what you're talking about is equally great. I think what has shifted is talent are increasingly comfortable and active in calling out companies publicly that are not doing what they say. So even with International Women's Day, it's no longer a conversation that's confined to Glassdoor. This is, public Twitter bots calling out companies for their gender pay gap, set up via an algorithm, at scale, high impact. These are organized, efficient movements against companies basically lying about their policy and practice in this area. So there is nowhere to hide. The truth will come out whether you want it to or not. So it's incredibly savvy to start internally, as you said, and actually put your money where your mouth is and show that you are changing things. The other thing I wanted to pick up on was the education point, which I think even the word education now has become quite difficult and problematic in the DEI space. And I think where the space was before was really on training and getting people into a room and telling them what they didn't know about DEI and hoping to change their minds. I think the problem with doing it, that's a great foundation, but I think the problem is that there's become a backlash to that idea of we have to educate people. And I think maybe the way that some of that training was delivered didn't land because there was no follow-up. There was nothing that came through. So people have got kind of fatigued with the education element, and they almost need to be shown rather than told. So I think we also need to rethink the way that we approach helping people to understand the importance of DEI. And I think that's through making it less intellectualized and less scary and intimidating for people, and making it more common sense. So every time you develop a policy, every time you think about a piece of communications, every time you think about a way that you're working, just starting to embed the idea of people asking themselves, who am I excluding with this approach? Who, what talent am I leaving on the bench? Who am I basically alienating with the way that I'm doing things? And if you can bring it back to that basic level and get people to embody that, you're already starting to shift a culture without them feeling like it's a thing they do in 2 hours and they never have to think about it again. So I think where some of that approach failed, and yes, we have to start with education, but where some of that failed was not actually embedding it practically into every single aspect of culture and decision making throughout an organization. And I think the other challenge people had was thinking that one person, a head of DEI, was going to be responsible for having the difficult conversations, influencing leaders, setting policy, and activating change throughout an entire organization single-handedly, which is why we've seen such high levels of burnout from those roles.
Yeah, definitely. And we have a question coming up, which is about where does that focus sit? Does it sit across every single person on the board, every single person in the leadership team, or should it sit in a siloed space like HR? And I'm sure you guys have some really strong opinions on that.
Yona, you want to pick up on that one?
Yeah, I actually think that it sits with everyone. I mean, if diversity is in our daily lives, it is in our workplace and basically everywhere else. Ideally, I think it sits with everyone, and usually, XCOM and the leadership team do drive things if they want to, but it also has to start from somewhere. And if there isn't someone to drive the agenda, whether it's a dedicated person or a dedicated team or someone kind of taking ownership and driving it, I think that it can end up as to the education piece that Emily was saying, it could end up nowhere, or just doing the bare minimum, or just changing a logo and actually not putting any substance. So I think that, and it's interesting because I was at a Women in Equity conference just a couple of weeks ago, and everyone was showing how they worked on their DEI agenda, especially for gender diversity, and everyone started with leadership buy-in. Every single one of those presentations, that's how they started their strategy. So I definitely think that it is needed, but it also needs someone to kind of follow through, because XCOM teams and leadership teams, they also have a lot going on, and sometimes if you don't have someone that is particularly interested in the topic, it will kind of fall through. So you do need someone to just to motivate everyone. But I don't think that it is the main responsibility, that if we don't reach any of the DEI targets or KPIs or anything like that, it's just down to one person who has taken this job. I think it's down to basically everyone.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I couldn't agree more. I was just going to add very briefly, I think, you look at it the same way we've started moving the conversation on sustainability. You can have a sustainability person talk about sustainability, but unless you look at the materials you're using, unless you look at the supply chain, unless you actually make tangible changes throughout your organization, you're not going to have an impact. It's exactly the same with DEI. So absolutely leadership buy-in and the willingness to make the changes and the recommendations of that person throughout your organization, and an acknowledgement that in making that choice, it is a conscious choice, it will have an impact on your business, arguably in hugely positive ways, but potentially it also means making decisions about, for example, whether you take on a client that doesn't share your values, or whether you're prepared to work with someone publicly that is at odds with what you believe about DEIB. It does have business implications. So unless you have leadership buy-in, it's not going to move the needle.
I think it's really interesting thinking about parallel spaces as well. So you would never have a CEO or a managing director of a business actively and publicly running an unsafe business, flouting health and safety rules or regulations. It's a straight go to jail card. I do wonder if at one point in the mid or longer term future, we actually bring in the safety and well-being of people and DE&I as part of that in the same way, because a lot of the conventional ways of running a company and the regulations and the laws that guide that are still only shareholder focused. So in the UK, for example, a company director's statutory and fiduciary duty is to the shareholders first. and foremost. And it's quite interesting. I wonder if there's a regulatory change that needs to come in, or a legislative change that needs to come in to put this and put people as being on par with shareholder return. It's an interesting topic. I don't know if you guys have thought about that at all.
You see that happening with sustainability initiatives as well, for example. So actually, people have talked about having the earth as a shareholder in the business, and there's a lot of new thinking being done in that space. So absolutely should be done in the DEIB space to move the needle. I think shareholders are increasingly interested in what people are doing and what companies are doing in this space, because they understand it's not going away anytime soon. I think in some cases shareholders are further ahead than the businesses themselves, but of course they also still want to see a profit. I don't think the two are incompatible. In fact, DEIB can massively help with your profit if you think about the very simple fact that your customer audience should be reflected by the people, ideas, stories that you're telling, and the thought process you're going through about including the widest possible audience for your business, as well as, you know, internally. I wanted to add a point, but I'll let Yona jump in and then we'll circle back.
No, I just wanted to say, in terms of regulation, I hadn't particularly thought about it, but I do think that at the pace that the world is changing, there are, you know, so many things, including regulation, that might need to get adapted to this new world. Like, for example, when we think about diversity, I love how today even the amount of TV shows available, they reflect diversity a lot better than when I was growing up. And I know there is a question about Gen Z later, but I was so surprised, and I guess in a good way, when Gen Z kind of called out all the moments during one of my favorite TV shows, Friends, where people were, you know, homophobic or expressing some sort of well, things that nowadays you wouldn't want to see on TV. And I think that's, you know, that just shows that things are evolving, and definitely regulation and shareholders will have to keep up with that.
Hollywood's a great example as well, right? Because you're seeing blockbusters with, you know, casts like you've got Black Panther being led by a mainly Black cast. You've got big Asian movies winning big in Hollywood, with, you know, in an industry where they said, oh, well, this is never going to make money. No one's going to be interested in this. So Hollywood in some ways is breaking boundaries that we're not baking in the basic workplace, to say, you know, we can have whole leadership teams that reflect a broader audience, and we should do, and they will make money.
Absolutely. And you touched earlier on about actions and transparency, and going back to that statistic about recruiters are looking for companies to really prioritize this. I'm just interested in both your employer brand experience. How have you seen DE&I implemented in your employer brand strategies, or even just other companies that you've been aware of? Yona, maybe first?
Yeah, so as I said, I think that DEI is not just something that sits on its own, whether I like it or not, or whether, you know, my company likes it or not. It's definitely going to play a part in our culture. And if we are going to be authentic about how we position ourselves as an employer, then it's also going to come up there. Because as I said earlier, if it exists in our daily lives and at work, it has to come up on how we represent ourselves and how we talk about ourselves. So I actually, when we were discussing about the webinar a couple of weeks ago, I gave an example of a different kind of diversity that happened in my workplace, which is, remember when I told you earlier that if I say the name Ledger in a company full of people who are into crypto, they would be big fans. Well, right now, people that work for Ledger either didn't hear about the company until they, you know, were reached out or applied, including me, or people that are diehard fans of crypto and everything in the space. So one of the areas, one of our proof points in our EVP that we're about to launch in a couple of weeks was actually helpfulness and learning from each other. Because even though I'm not an expert on crypto at all, there are quite a few of my colleagues that are, and the fact that we were able to kind of exchange this information, and I didn't feel excluded just because I didn't I didn't come from that sort of background. I think it adds up to diversity in general as well.
I think that's a really nice point that nods to Emily's earlier point about what inclusive means. It doesn't just mean what people think it means. It can stretch all the way out through to making environments hospitable from a knowledge perspective, an intellectual perspective, an accessibility perspective. And one of the things that we hear a lot in DEI and B is, oh, you'll never please everybody. You can't get everyone happy. You'll never be able to do enough. And I don't mind hearing that, because in my job as Chief Product Officer, that's exactly what I think about our product. Our product will never be finished. That's fine. My CFO colleague will never be finished optimizing our financial performance as well. It is a continuous task. And I think it's fine to be focused on that end goal that will continuously shift. I don't know, Emily, if that comes up in some of your client conversations within your agency.
Yes, definitely. I think the realization that DEI is not something that you can assign someone to and do as a project and then it's done and you don't have to worry about it anymore. I think people have been disillusioned of that perspective, which is a good thing. But I think at the same time, then you have the challenge that it's then a turn off for employers because it's not an easy fix, right? It is something that's actually genuinely really hard. And I think the level of heat on some of the conversations and the level of nuance that is expected from leaders is really intimidating to them. It's something it's a box they're really scared to open now because they're worried about being cancelled or saying the wrong thing. And I actually think the new frontier of DEI has to be about having hard conversations in a safe way, in a way where we can feel comfortable to get it wrong and to own our mistakes and to keep trying and to iterate and realize that we're never going to get it right for everyone all the time. But I think people really respect that transparency and that openness and that vulnerability to say, as a leader, I'm also learning and getting educated and, figuring it out. So I would always just say to leaders to try, because it's worse to just back away. And I think where we've seen companies try to back away from difficult conversations, like you see, the Coinbase founder saying, we're not going to talk about politics anymore. It's far too simplistic a view. Politics is not something that exists abstractly outside of businesses. If you look at things like the Edelman Trust Barometer, they're increasingly saying that people trust businesses to look at societal problems over governments or non-governmental organizations. So talent is increasingly looking to CEOs and leaders to have these nuanced conversations and to do it in a way that's open, honest, and vulnerable. And at the same time, they're shying away from it. And when you look at something that is political, like, for example, all the conversations around trans rights, for some people, that's not politics. So for some of your talent, that is going to be a fundamental human right to exist publicly. So if you can't have a conversation about that internally, something that affects your colleagues so deeply and so personally, they're afraid to be themselves, at work, whether that's their sexuality or, to be proud and talk openly about their race and what it means to them. If we're not creating a place where people can feel safe in the workplace or in society in general, and we don't think that's an important conversation as a business to have, that's a scarier place to be in for me if leaders are shying away from those conversations, because they're in one of the best positions to do something about it.
I think that's you've almost answered my next question, Emily, around how do you think it should be prioritised in the future? And I think we're sort of agreeing that there probably isn't a right answer for that. It's about transparency. It's about keep evolving and asking questions. But interesting, is there anything else around how do you think DEIB should be prioritised in the future that either of you can think of? Any particular strategies or actions that companies can take? Yona, maybe you first.
Oh, I was waiting I thought the question was meant for Emily. I think on top of what we already said, again, I want to stress the point that, again, it's not hiring someone to do a DEI, to work on DEI and expect that they deliver everything by themselves, even if they have a team. I think it's a good step, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you will definitely have a successful result out of it. Just a couple of things, and also because, as I mentioned, I was talking about DEI quite recently at a conference, and some of the things that a lot of people did on top of the executive buy-in is also looking at data, and I think this is a bit of personally, I have a bit of mixed feelings when it comes to KPIs and quotas and things like that. On one side, it always makes you question that, are you doing the right decision, or are you just trying to fill in a quota? But then on the other side, if there wasn't one, would you even be trying at all? So I'm still torn between the two, but in terms of data, I think it's important for companies to also know where they stand. And based on what I've heard from other companies, I think that data on DEI is really difficult, especially for some countries in Europe. I've heard. I mean, you can get maybe gender or legal gender, but then if you go deeper into all other characteristics or aspects, it can get a little bit more difficult. So I think that's a good starting point as well, but also maybe setting KPIs, not in terms of how many of this underrepresented group, but also just in terms of what kind of data should we be looking at, and what kind of data are important to us.
I think that's a really good idea on data as well. And one of the things we did with our survey is we focused on the 5 underrepresented groups. And when we then pulled that data out via a self-answered survey, all we used it for was to show that nearly half of the whole company had one or more of those 5 groups applicable to them. And what we've asked people to then do is ask the simple question: do I know someone who I love and I care about who is within one of these groups? And there you're at almost 100%. And I think that's how we've been using data. So the colder data to show why we're doing something, but then warming that data with anecdotes and emotion, and that emotionally intelligent piece to say this is about all of us. It's not just about the 3.6% who is minority A. It's about all of us in a specific way.
That really helps for sure to humanize things, and that's how people connect with ideas, and that's how you motivate people. They need to understand it, relate to it, connect with it. If it's abstract, it's very difficult to get people to change. But data definitely helps as a benchmark and a barometer, and to give you some tangible goals. It also helps for you to make public commitments to things. One thing I think is really interesting is if you look at the sort of slide, for example, on the gender pay gap, and the slide on sort of women's representation in the workforce that we've seen, the backward slide since COVID, since workplace policies have started changing again. We have to look at the interconnected issues and reasons for things not working. So you see companies, for example, saying, oh, we've got a massive gender pay gap, we'll throw money at the problem and we'll get everyone up on par. But what they then don't invest in is supporting those women to work flexibly, or creating equal parental care leave policies, or looking at reasons, for example, why women aren't getting promoted. Because what happens is you address the balance, and then those women get left behind again, and you're back to where you started. So you haven't actually fixed the root cause of the problem. And I think often companies are looking for those quick wins. So it has to be a long commitment. And if you're asking someone to make that long commitment, they have to understand why they're doing it. So, when we're working on employer value propositions as well with clients, we say, why do you want one? Just because everyone else has one? Or what are the actual problems in your organization that you're trying to solve through defining your employer brand? Is it, a struggle with recruiting a certain demographic? Or is it that you're excluding certain members of your workforce? What are the problems you're trying to solve? Because then you can work towards a solution that actually helps address those problems, rather than doing it as a thing that you feel you have to do, without really connecting it to tangible business goals. So it might be, for example, that you're failing to connect with your customers because you're failing to bring a certain workforce to the surface that could connect better with them. So if you tie it to those business goals, it's much easier for leadership as well to engage with why they're doing it in the first place, other than they're told it's a thing they should be doing.
I think that definitely mirrors how next generation leaders want to work as well. And we've all mentioned Gen Z, Gen Z, and it's really interesting thinking about where we'll be in X years' time when the majority of a leadership team might be what we class as Gen Z today. How do you think it's going to change? Because they have shown in significant ways as a grouping that they generally want to do things differently in areas like climate change and attitudes to different things in the workplace. How do you think that them being in leadership roles will change how we approach belonging specifically?
I guess the question is whether they get to those leadership roles in the first place, because we have a lot of people checking out because then they're not prepared to give all of themselves to an organization that doesn't truly see them as individuals. And I think that's part of the problem, that disengagement piece first. So before they can get to those leadership roles and make change happen from the top, they have to be engaged with being in the workplace in general. And we're seeing less engagement.
Yeah.
And I also think we're seeing, I saw some statistics recently, which I'll dig up for you and share afterwards, which were also around people choosing not to identify certain elements of themselves. So they're not sharing, you know, to Jona's point about data, they're not necessarily sharing things like their sexuality. They're not sharing things like that aren't surface obvious. You know, some people might actually have racial differences they're not declaring. So I think people are increasingly protecting themselves against the organization, and that's a problem, because unless we're leaning in and bringing those elements of ourselves that make us different, then we're not actually leading in the authentic way that drives change and creates those role models, because people are scared to be their full selves. So it starts again back with trust and safe spaces. If we're not safe enough to, you know, if I'm not safe enough to speak from the perspective of my background, of being a woman, of being a person of color, and I retreat into a sort of office persona that I feel I have to put on that doesn't take into consideration any of the experiences that I've had with discrimination, then I'm not actually adding value to the conversation. But those conversations are difficult and scary to have if you're in a place that isn't safe for you to have those conversations. So I think it starts with safety and trust.
I wonder if it also leads to, so some of the trends that we monitor as a company focused on brand is around the trend of homogenization just now, where a lot of logos are starting to end up in a similar space. Companies are starting to use similar color palettes. Typography choices are becoming narrower, and you can see that in lots of different ways. I think one of the motoring magazines recently released a silhouette calendar of every one of the top 100 cars sold, and they all look very, very same. Everything is merging. And I wonder if we might risk seeing that within leadership, an emulation of, well, if I'm going to exclude all of the bits that make me, me, all that's left then is tomorrow's leaders leading in a way that they think is compatible with today's leaders, much of which is based on what was fine to be yesterday's leadership. And that creates a problem, right?
Yes, I think so. I think it's really difficult to be vulnerable and be fully yourself as a leader. I mean, I've experienced this now, being in a leadership position myself. I want to speak as myself and bring all the elements that make me to the table and be vocal about that publicly. But it's also scary because you want to put your co-founder front on and say, okay, this is what a business leader looks like, and you can't talk about having a difficult week. I talked about being tired on LinkedIn the other day, and the amount of people that were like, that's so brave. Like, aren't we all bloody tired? Aren't we all exhausted? Jeez. I think that was,
I did love it.
Right. Like, people were so grateful that I just said something out loud that I think everyone was feeling. But I think we have this perception people have to lead a certain way, project a certain image. And that's one of the worst things I think we can do as leaders. But what I do understand is that there was a period where DEI was opening up, that people felt super safe to have these conversations. And they, you know, after George Floyd, people felt like finally there's a conversation that's being had that reflects the fears that I have every day, you know. And people opened themselves up, and, you know, they talked more about their sexuality. They talked more about every aspect of themselves, and they were prepared to be ambassadors for companies and, you know, bring all of these things. And they got burnt out. They got burnt out then not seeing their colleagues change or seeing a backlash against some of the things they were sharing, and people will retreat. So I think we have a real problem with that, and I think that starts with having those safe conversations, but also with us being brave enough to role model that if we can. If we feel we're in a position to do so, then I hope that people will do it and be authentic and put themselves out there. But I acknowledge the fear.
Definitely. And not every company is at the same stage. I know, Danielle, you have a poll that you want to run for the last bit of the session, don't you?
Yes, absolutely. So we are going to do a poll for the audience to ask, how well do you feel DE&I for belonging is embedded in your company culture? So we're going to open that up whilst we ask Yona and Emily another final question. So we're going to keep that open. Hopefully we'll get some good answers there. So feel free to pop your answer to the question in the poll. So our last question for Emily and Yona before we have some audience questions are, what are your final thoughts around how we can fight for DE&I as a business priority? Acknowledging that a lot of people are scared to talk about these things in the workplace, but what can companies do to ensure, and what can people do to ensure that we really fight for this as a business priority?
If Emily's last bit didn't inspire people yet, or what we've been talking about until now, maybe just like a quick summary, which means I'm probably going to repeat myself a little bit, but I think that DEI, it's just the right thing to do. And I think it's also good for business. So it's not some sort of agenda or some sort of fancy project. I just think it's something that benefits everyone. And I think the first step that companies, but maybe even colleagues, employees, and everyone that need to do is maybe acknowledge where they are in a DEI journey, kind of with what we're doing now. So whether as a company, being honest and transparent that, you know what, we haven't really put much effort into it, but we want to, or say what you're actually going to do instead of just like keeping up with the trends of changing logos and things like that. And then as a person, as an employee, as a leader or whatever, I think it's probably starting from the same place, acknowledging where you are in your DEI journey, whether you need some more education, awareness, information that you can either find yourself or the company can provide to you. And I think it's all about being honest and true to that first question, and see how you can start the journey, whether you need education, whether you as a company are willing to actually set an example and take a more important role than just do the things because I'm expected to have a DEI person, or I'm expected to hire people of all diverse backgrounds and things like that. And then as a person, again, I think it's important to know that in today's world, it's not going to be possible to live in a bubble or work from home forever. So diversity is just wherever we are. So to summarize, I think acknowledging where you are as a person or as a company, and kind of realizing the work that you need to do, and also making it clear what is your objective. Because if as a company you again want to do the bare minimum, at least acknowledge that. And if you want to set an example, again, strive towards that and be very clear with your objectives and how you're going to get there. And personally, again, because I don't think that this is just a company thing, I think people need to be taking an action themselves as well, and sometimes even pushing the companies. So again, as a person, depends on the role that you want to play, whether you want to be politically correct and don't want to, cause some faux pas or anything like that, or if you actually want to make a difference, and if you want to, inspire change and actually get some results.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great point about accountability as well for yourself. And how about you, Emily? Any sort of final thoughts around that question before we go into the audience questions?
Just that the culture we set as businesses is a conscious choice, and it's a choice that doesn't have to be fixed, it can keep evolving. But it is something that you create consciously. So there are decisions in every element of your culture. There are choices that you have to make. And I think challenge your leaders, ask every day, who are we excluding with this culture or this choice that we're making? What contribution could those people we're excluding be making to our business? How will this impact our chances of success and reflect the customers we serve? Just keep being the person that asks those questions. And I say the same with employer branding. Like, I try not to talk about employer branding. I try to just talk about creating culture and talking about your culture, and connecting it to your business success. Because as soon as something becomes a thing, it's very difficult for it to be taken as seriously and as in as integral a way as it should be. So just starting to weave in conversations that ask about exclusion, that ask about whether we are being fair and equitable at every stage in a decision-making point in your journey will already start to move the needle in small ways and big on DEI and B.
Fantastic. I think that's a really, really good point to close on from the experts we've got and pass to some questions, which will point towards Emily and Jonna, if that's okay. Just before we do, on the poll, really, really interesting. 80% of people have chosen 3, 4, or 5 stars, which is anywhere from being better in some aspects than others, right through to it feeling like a key part of culture. That feels quite motivational and optimistic. It definitely feels like the vast majority of people are working towards something, even if they're not there yet. Only one 5-star answer saying it really feels like DEI and B is a fundamental part of culture. That's a fantastic place to be in, but only one person. So it definitely shows that we've started journeys and we have more work to do. We've got some questions from the audience, and I think they also continue with that theme. So Christina says, I'm curious, what are some effective ways to promote diversity and inclusion in the recruitment and hiring processes, especially when there is this cultural play around filling headcount? So we talked about this earlier. It's a tough time to be a recruiter just now. I'm not sure it's always been easy, but it's specifically tough now. How do they keep one eye on DEI and B? What are your top tips? I think you both unmuted.
We did. Go ahead, Jonna, if you want. I'm still thinking anyway.
I just something that I actually wanted to add a little bit earlier as well, and this has to do with recruitment and a little bit of employer brand as well. I think the tone of how we present ourselves and the language that we use is so important that sometimes you, on top of your recruitment process and seeing how diversity plays a role in that, it's also who you are attracting when you put that job description. How does it sound? Who is it appealing for? There is a great tool called Gender Decoder that I think probably everyone knows, but it's always helpful to check your job description, whether it is more masculine or feminine. And there are also some other tools that consider diversity more broadly, including neurodiversity and all the other aspects, which is called Textio. And I hope in the future I can afford to use something like that is being conscious of basically every word that you say can have a different impact on other people. And just because I don't see it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. So I would say focusing on attraction first, seeing who you are attracting with how you are presenting yourself, the company, and also the job that you're hiring for.
Thank you, Jonna. Emily, anything to add?
Yeah, I think those are really good points. I think AI can be used for good or for evil as well. I think we're seeing increasingly recruiters being stretched and having to knock up their job descriptions via AI tooling. Just be conscious that that is also a system that has learned behaviors, and some of those learned behaviors come inherently with bias. So use a human to gut check it, or several humans who come at it from different perspectives. Always, if you can, just ask someone's opinion. How is this reading? Would this alienate you? and put yourself in the shoes of different audiences. So we talk a lot about creating personas, which are both helpful and unhelpful. They also contain bias and, you know, an assumption about who someone is. But what they are useful for is putting yourself in someone else's shoes and just thinking about whether the way you position this job or the way that you're talking about the company would actually appeal to them, and if there are things that would be more relevant to them. So I think our inherent bias is always there, right? And we haven't talked much about bias, but what's very important to realize is you have hundreds of different bias within your own self that you are projecting onto everything you're reading, seeing, every piece of content you put out. So just get some other opinions, and check your own bias. So note that, you know, I will always look for parental policy because I'm a parent, someone else might not care. Note that you're always looking for the things that you care about as a candidate, and try and put yourself, as you do as a recruiter every day, if you're a good recruiter, in the candidate's shoes and think about what they would care about hearing more about.
Emily, that's a perfect segue to another question, and it's specifically for you, because this is something I didn't know, but it's a question from another Emily asking about Booking.com's grandparent leave. Can you tell us a little bit about where that came from and what difference it made, and if you see things like that happening in other environments?
Yeah, you know what? I can't speak for Booking because I haven't been there for about 5 years now, although I'm still always aware of the great work that they're doing. What I think is really interesting in that, and I referenced it actually in a DEI talk I gave the other day, because I think it's an interesting impact of the shifting nature of the talent landscape and talent needs actually starting to influence action and policy, which I think is fantastic. So we saw it with airlines, and I think it was Dixon's or B&Q in the UK starting to hire retirees back because they realize they're not filling those seats. Every time I get on an airplane, I see an older person. You know, it used to be just young people fresh out of college or school being air stewards, but now I see stewards of all ages who are obviously retirees who are coming back into the workforce, which I think is amazing. So I think we have been forced in our businesses to rethink who our target audience is. It's the same with the hospitality industry, which I do a lot of work on. And in fact, we're doing an event on the 5th of July in Amsterdam. If anyone's interested in the hospitality industry, they are also having to pivot and think differently about who they hire, because they aren't necessarily able to rely on talent who've traditionally been able to afford to live close to where they work, or they've relied on talent who've immigrated from other countries, and that's no longer as easy in the UK, for example. So we have to rethink. And that also means changing the policies and practices that are important to people, which is a great thing. You know, so if that drives change within an organization because of those shortages, I'm all for it. And I'm sure it will have a big impact. I think in some cases, policies can be great PR exercises, but actually, even if it is only that surface deep and that's the only impact it has, it still inspires other organizations to think outside of the box on what they offer.
Yeah. I'm going to ask two very quick questions, just a yes or a no answer, if possible. So the first one is from Kevin. There seems to be some kind of DEI and B metric in every annual report, and some companies are even starting to link this to exec pay. Do you think this is the way to go to ensure senior leadership's care? It's a strong yes or no.
Yes, if I'm only allowed to answer with one word, yes. I think it's a good start.
Yeah, same here. I think I've seen something similar with sustainability reports as well.
I'll do one more because I love these yes or no's. So a question from Joe that's asking about, everyone's got competing priorities just now, the economic slowdown in some sectors. Is it realistic for senior leadership to focus on DEI and B as a strategic priority?
Yes, as I said, I think diversity is good for business if you do realize it and if you know what you have to do. But I can see why it is a challenge for many companies right now. But yes.
Yes, and I'm going to have one sentence. Yes, but it doesn't sit in isolation on its own. So if productivity is your biggest goal, which it is all of my clients at the moment, realize that your DEIB policies have an impact on people's productivity. and connect it to your overarching strategy and your business priorities.
Conscious of time, I might ask one more question. So Georgina has asked, we need to be more conscious about how we do performance management for neurodiverse staff. Do you have any suggestions? And I think this is a really interesting question. I myself am neurodivergent, and I know that the way I give feedback and the way I receive feedback are slightly different from neurotypical ways of working. I've learned to adapt over years, but what do we do to make sure that it's inclusive for anyone who is neurodivergent around performance reviews?
I think it's a great question, and one of the, again, when you go back to that idea of who are we excluding, thinking about the way we do things, and is there someone for whom this doesn't work, and do we have the ability to be flexible for those people? It's the same conversation about open workplaces, you know, that doesn't work for everyone, and actually allowing some flexibility for people to make a choice creates an even playing field for everyone. So I think it's just acknowledging that not everyone's starting from the same place and not motivated in the same way or able to do things in the same way as others, and that's fine. But if you don't allow for that, their performance will suffer and their chances of success will suffer, which doesn't help your business.
Yeah, same here. Just as we are, you know, putting effort into attracting diverse talent, and then we're making adjustments to assessment and how we assess people with different needs and different abilities, I think we definitely need to look into performance management. But I don't have like a quick fix or any suggestion on how to do that yet. So watching that space, same as you, Georgina.
And it would be completely wrong to not give you a plug. So yes, of course, Emily, follow the TruthWorks on LinkedIn for details. Make sure you're following Yona as well. We have a link in the bottom left if you are interested in speaking to someone at Papirfly about how to activate your DE&I strategies within employer branding. Let us know, and we will finish there. Thank you so much. It's been a really inspiring session, and I hope everyone leaves this thinking about what they can do in the rest of the year. H2 is upon us. How do we make it a really strong year for everything, performance, productivity, and inclusion as well? So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll say goodbye.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Yona.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.